pandemic has forced governments from both sides of the political divide globally to support a bigger state and massive spending to sustain livelihoods and companies. But despite this political convergence, divisions in society are deep and profound, with many people feeling disenfranchised by a political system that seemingly offers no radical change. Is this convergence a short-term blip? Will parties on the left and right soon form new agendas? Will they give voice to dissent? Or is the current convergence not temporary, but an inevitable result of democracy, as the need to win majorities forces both sides into the centre? Or are we seeing the transition to a new form of politics altogether, in which traditional notions of left and right are abandoned? Well, we've got four fantastic speakers who are going to be talking about that for us today. Peter Lilley is a British Conservative Party politician and member of the House of Lords. He was a cabinet minister in the governments of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and has been a long-term critic of the European Union. Paul Mason is a British political commentator and radio personality, a former member of the radical Workers' Power Group. Paul describes his politics as now, quotes, very complicated. Peter Mandelson is a British Labour Party politician who's held positions as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry and Northern Ireland. He's a former European Trade Commissioner and British First Secretary of State. And Ella Whelan is a freelance journalist, commentator and author, well known for her defence of both women's freedom and free speech, and she is an organiser of this year's Battle of Ideas. We're going to start with 3 uninterrupted minutes, the last uninterrupted minutes any of you will probably have, just to lay out your thoughts on the core question, which is, are the left and right converging, and do we need more radical solutions to the many problems that we see before us and which politics surely has to solve? And I'll start, if I may, with Peter Lilley.
Normally, the first past the post system in the UK and America and elsewhere means that parties do converge. They have to overlap. They can't afford to go out to an extreme and cede the centre ground to the other side. But something's gone wrong. It hasn't been working in America, to a lesser extent here, in a number of other countries. Why is that? Now, my analysis, and I put it forward as a hypothesis, and I'm particularly interested to hear Peter Mandelson's views on it, is that the Labour Party, the left in most countries, has always consisted of a coalition between the intellectuals who believed in socialism and the organised working class who provided the vote and usually moderated the opinions of the intellectuals. If you read George Orwell, you'll see he says that almost all socialists are middle class. They have contempt for the working class, but they need them. They need the organised working class to deliver the vote and get them into power. And that forces them to moderate their views and their opinions. And indeed to conceal their contempt for the working class with whom they're working. Now, what has happened is that the organised working class in most countries has lost power, has lost its base, trade union membership has fallen. It hasn't been there. At the same time, the intellectual class, people who've been to university, like all of you, and learned to manipulate words, have become more powerful, and many of them are socialists, and they feel that they're probably the majority. They're not, of course. And they think they can go it alone without the organised working class. They go to an extreme, and they lose. Or they create an opportunity for the other party to go to its extreme. That's what happened in America. The Democrats went to extreme. Hillary Clinton actually described the working class voters as a basket of contemptibles. And they reacted as you would if someone said that they despised you. But that gave an opportunity for Trump to go out to another extreme. He won one election, lost the next. In this country, Jeremy Corbyn took the Labour Party to an extreme with the consent of a massive new membership of the Labour Party. And it's going to be very difficult for it to get back to the centre. I think it's important that it does, because I want the Conservatives to win elections generally. From time to time, it's important they lose and that we have an alternative government. And at the moment, we don't have an alternative government. And I don't know how that's going to happen when you've got intellectuals who despise the working class having revealed their contempt, and the working class having said, thank you very much, we'll vote for the other lot.
Thanks very much, Peter, for that introduction. Just as a very quick straw poll, everyone here who went to university, please stick up your hands. Everyone who didn't go to university, please stick up your hands. Okay, so I'd say that the vast majority did in fact go, but just worth checking that out on a factual basis. Good to know. Paul Mason, could I turn to you? Are we converging on left and right? Do we need more radical solutions?
Well, of course, we've now discovered that we need a big state, but we didn't discover it because of COVID. We discovered it when the financial system of the world collapsed in 2008, and the state saved the market that ran so far against the accepted wisdom in economics that many people were shocked. But there is a bigger issue facing us even than financial collapse, and that is climate change. I would say for the last 100 years, what characterized one of the characteristics of left politics, and I am of the left, has been a relaxed attitude towards time. So you get the Keir Hardie generation believed, they would only be trusted with power if they could educate themselves and organize and build up the labor movement's strength. Rosa Luxemburg, the German revolutionary murdered in 1919, on the last article she wrote before being extrajudicially killed, said, the revolution marches to victory through a series of defeats. Both the reformist and revolutionary traditions of the left believed they had time. Martin Luther King, quoting a 19th century clergyman, said, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. He should have added, eventually. Climate change places a ticking clock in the agenda of every political tradition. And my argument that is either we decarbonize the world by the middle of this century, or we spiral into a series of shocks and aftershocks that we cannot predict the social and economic outcome of. I would argue that what now characterizes the left, and it may indeed be that left that Peter doesn't like, the one that is educated, that I would argue forms a new working class. What characterizes it is that it is now prepared to take time seriously and take urgency seriously. What I think we will see pan out in politics, the most important, whether or not the electorate understands this, it's for us, those who do understand it, to lead. We will now see play out the following debate. What are you prepared to do to decarbonize the economy of this country? The left answer is make inroads into the wealth and power of capitalists. Because we've tried it the market way, we've tried it through carbon cap and trade, through permits. We took a 4 billion year old planet, screwed it up with 250 years of carbon capitalism, and then thought that a system invented 25 years ago, the sort of free market capitalism, could solve it. It hasn't. We're going to have to take away the ownership of the energy system from the private sector. But I think that's why the left cannot be missed. You will never mistake us on a dark night for the people who are going to let this planet fry and who will be responsible for ecocide by the middle of the century.
Ella.
Thank you. Well, I don't think that left and right are converging, though it can be difficult to figure out what they stand for anymore. I think that's the main point, that both those on the left and those on the right, at least in mainstream sense, have had their ideologies hollowed out. What it means to be right now, right wing, is really anything that's not lefty. And what lefty means is really become rather superficial. It means sort of being nice to people, maybe arguing for a few food banks here and there, and having a problem with open discussion around issues like race and gender and identity politics. And I could sit here and say, the solution, and as the question asks, the need for more radical solutions is to re-establish what left and right means. If the left wing is to get serious about us arguing for economic revolution, rather than just relying on Keir Starmer trying to hobble the Prime Minister over 20 quid here or there on universal credit. I also could say to my opponents on the right, well, you need to get more serious about arguing for the capitalist class, that you need to get more serious about cracking down on the tendency to be socially liberal, that, you should start being real bosses rather than lecturing your workers on which charity to give to and whether or not to ride a bike or drive a car to work, because at least then I'd have some kind of opponent to bounce off of. But I think that this obsession, really, with whether or not we can figure out what left or right means anymore is it's the misunderstanding of today's political crisis, which is that it's not an absence or left or right that is really crippling us, but it's an absence of democracy, and that's part of today's title, Dissent, Division and Democracy. It is the deficit of democracy and the misunderstanding of what democracy means that I think is really putting a barrier between any kind of radical solutions or political change. Now, obviously, the right have never been particularly enamored with democracy. They don't really like the idea that the pauper or the worker should have as much say in politics or how the world is run than the professor or indeed the expert or the capitalist. But part of the problem is that the left, who maybe perhaps once, some of them argued for freedom of speech, well, from Thomas Rainsborough to Fred Hampton, saying that every man or woman could have as much say as the highest in society. That's gone. Today people are not to be trusted. They're not to be trusted with important things like climate change. If you give too much access to social media, John will turn into a troll. If you give too much ability for Jane to speak freely, she'll probably turn into a bigot. I think the real radical idea we have to look at is, as rather than left and right, is whether you are a Democrat or an anti-Democrat. And I mean that in the abstract sense, whether you really take seriously the idea that politics and the shaping of the world is for everyone to get to be involved in, rather than just being obsessed with which party stands for what.
And for the final introductory thought on that question, are the left and right converging? Do we need more radical solutions? Peter Mandelson.
Well, Rana, let me correct the record straight away and let Peter Lilley know that I did not join the Labour Party, and I do not consider myself on the left of British politics because I'm an intellectual who despises the working class. The reason why I'm on the left in politics and the reason why I support the Labour Party is because I believe in a politics in which you align yourself with other people who think similarly, who believe in a party of conscience and reform. Conscience because you are concerned about those who have less and who want more, and you want to lean heavily against inequalities in society. You want to create the opportunities and the freedom that comes from a strong, enduring platform of public services in your country from which people can derive real freedom. Also, a society in which people recognize that they have both rights, individual rights, but also obligations and responsibilities. So that's how I would define the left, and I believe that the left has as valid a set of credentials and ideas and proposals that it's always had. I'm not so sure, however, that those on the left organize themselves with as much efficacy as they have done in the past, and that's why we tend to lose elections rather than win them. My last point is this: what is driving both left and right in a particular direction, and that direction does see an expanding role for the state and a higher level of public spending than we thought was necessary or desirable over the last 30 years, is not ideology, and it's not focus groups. It's a combination of demography and science and technology. Demography, because we have an aging population where people's healthcare needs and their care demands are growing, and where the state has to respond properly. But also science and technology, because as Paul Mason has said, we are grappling with a climate emergency. And that climate emergency has to be addressed beyond borders and internationally, not by ideology, but by climate science and new technologies, as it will be in the coming decades. So it's not politics that's driving us towards the centre in that sense, it's policy. The policy that arises from shifts in demography and the policy that is demanded by science and technology to address the climate crisis that we are experiencing.
Peter, thanks very much, and thank you all four for really thoughtful introductions to this debate. Let's start by a little discussion on...
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.